Hello and welcome to FP's virtual dialogue, Promise over Peril, the realities and risks of generative AI. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on one of the most transformative technological advancements of our time, and that is generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI. Now, Gen AI is reshaping our world, whether we like it or not. For good or for bad, Gen AI is here. The question is how we use it. And the incredible growth of AI power is a source of both fascination and concern. On the one hand, it promises groundbreaking developments in sectors like global health, trade, and development. But on the other, it raises serious questions about control, security, and ethical considerations, especially regarding its potential militarization and cyber applications. And as we've witnessed time and again, technological advancement often outpaces policy and regulatory frameworks, leaving legislators and regulators in a perpetual game of catch-up. It is worth asking then, what are the essential rules and ethical standards that the United States must establish now? And let's be clear, these measures are crucial not only to maximize the innovative potential of Gen AI, but also to minimize its risks and to avoid a destabilizing arms race, particularly with actors like China. Our event today is a collaboration between Foreign Policy and the Special Competitive Studies Project, and it comes at a critical moment. Last week at Britain's AI Safety Summit, leaders unveiled the Bletchley Declaration endorsed by 28 countries, including the United States and China. And the declaration highlights the urgent need to address challenges posed by advanced frontier AI systems. The week prior, President Joe Biden issued a sweeping set of AI rules and guidelines requiring greater transparency from AI firms regarding their model operations and content labeling. So, why are we here today? Well, in this conversation and in the ones to follow, our hope is to provide a balanced perspective amidst the hype and hyperbole. We also want to address the realities and opportunities of Gen AI in concrete terms. So thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. Before we start, I want to be sure that we can hear from you, our audience. We have hundreds of people tuned into our event platform and who are watching on our live streams on social media. Use the Q&A button on Zoom to ask a question, or on the page you're on if it's a live stream. I will try and use your question, or at least channel the sentiment of it. I also encourage you to chime in on social media with the hashtag #PromiseOverPeril. So let's get going. I have an important first guest, Representative Anna Eshop. She is the U.S. Member of Congress from California's 16th District, representing Silicon Valley. Congresswoman Eshop has made significant impacts during her over 2 decades in Congress. Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in AI in 2023, and she previously served as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, the first woman to serve in a leadership role in that subcommittee's history. Congresswoman, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.
It's our pleasure. So I thought I'd begin with this. What do you make of President Biden's executive order on the development and use of AI just issued last week?
Well, I think that it's both timely and I think it's balanced. It also is a reflection, I think, of a great deal of work because, as you so succinctly opened the program today, there are so many challenges because there is great promise, we know, with artificial intelligence and what it can do across so many sectors, but it also represents a peril that needs to be addressed. So I think that the standards that the executive order set, it promotes innovation and competition. It ensures that AI advances equity and civil rights. It protects American consumers, patients, students, and it supports American workers. So I think it's broad and it's deep, but as we all know, an executive order, as important as it is, because it really jumpstarts what the executive branch agencies are assigned to do, and the president does that in the order. But any new administration can erase that. So it really, it's only the Congress that can write statutes, which are laws. And so I think that it's very important. I support it. As I said, I think it's balanced and it looks to the future. But it also, I think, is gives a green light, so to speak, to Congress to write the statutes.
Barkan, who's in the California State Assembly, told Politico last week that, quote, none of us trust that DC can get there fast enough. Do you share that assessment? Are you worried about whether our Congress in DC is broken and, if other states or other actors need to do more instead?
Well, there isn't any fallback to the Congress. The Congress is our nation's legislature, and while we're struggling on many fronts, and there are many things that are broken, I have a cautious optimism about Congress and artificial intelligence. There is broad interest in it on the part of, I think, the majority of members. On the Senate side, you've seen where the majority leader has brought together the leaders on artificial intelligence. And I co-chair the bipartisan Artificial Intelligence Caucus in the House. And one of the things that I've worked hard to bring to the fore is to bring in people that are experts. No member of Congress is going to say, I don't understand this. So I've worked hard to develop, the fundamentals so that there is an understanding on the part of members. You can't legislate on something that you don't understand. And so that understanding, I think, is very, very important. Now, I've offered legislation in key areas, and I'm very pleased that my legislation is mirrored in the executive order, the CREATE Act.
I was going to ask you about the CREATE AI Act, because is it meant to align with President Biden's executive order? Is it an add-on? And depending on your answer to that, I'm curious whether we're at risk of creating a quilt patchwork of sort of state laws.
Well, let me just speak to the legislation. I wrote the legislation and offered it before the executive order. So I'm very pleased that the administration really builds into the executive order what my legislation is. Today, AI is really mostly in the hands of a handful of high technology companies. And while they are the leaders in it, I believe that this needs to be democratized. And what do I mean by that? This needs to be across all sectors. Let me just make a point about the medical sector in our country. I recently had a conversation with a pediatric radiologist and his colleagues at other medical centers in the country. They were very, very concerned about AI products in radiological devices, but they weren't accurate. And what every doctor said to me is, we cannot practice on children. So now that's an area that calls for legislation, because the FDA does not have the jurisdictions right now to address that. So now in the meetings, over in the Senate with the AI leaders, the medical sector was not included. So the medical sector needs to be included in this in our country. The public sector needs to be included. the academic centers in our country need to be included. They need to have access to what is so powerful, so that it again, I would use the term that AI is democratized. And Stanford University is the in the heart of my congressional district, and so I've worked closely with Stanford and their Human AI Center there, which is recognized across the country for the work that they are doing. And really, the legislation has come out of a partnership between myself and that center. And I say bravo to them, because they've been highly instructive to me in the legislation that I've offered. So the legislation is bipartisan, it is bicameral, and I want to get this over the finish line in this Congress.
Sort of the title of our event today is The Promise and Peril.
Yes, I've used that term. I'm so pleased with it, because I've in speaking to constituents and to many advocates, I've said that AI has enormous promise, but there is also the issue of peril.
So, and you've spoken about some of the promise, some of you use the word democratizing ability of AI. But let's talk about the peril for a minute. So many people over the last year, people in power, serious people who watch AI, have been warning about, the impacts that this technology and the rate and pace of its growth can have on humanity. And are you worried about government's ability to keep up? Yes, you're working on the regulation you mentioned. Yes, the White House has its executive order, but does it strike you that any of that is enough? Can it keep up with the pace of change?
Well, that's our responsibility to address the challenge. And it's why I introduced the Artificial Intelligence and Biosecurity Risk Assessment Act. Now, it's a real mouthful. Again, it's bipartisan legislation. It directs the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, we call it ASPR, to monitor advancements in AI, how it could be used to develop novel pathogens, because the biosecurity area is a very important area relative to the government. Last October, I wrote a letter to the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Security Council, urging the Biden administration to address dual-use AI biosecurity risks. So the risks are there. It's up to us to go deep in the agencies that have the responsibility to address biosecurity, and this needs to be built into legislation so that it's codified.
And so let me ask you this, given that you are so cognizant of the risks, do you get the sense that, say, Europe has taken the lead when it comes to thinking about AI regulation, or China? How do you place the United States in terms of competing with rivals?
It's an excellent question. I think that given what took place with last December, that in January, this was the new thing. So I think that since January, there's been not only a great deal of interest.
Well, I'll just say respectfully, Congresswoman, I mean, Europe has been working on AI regulation for more than 2 years.
I didn't get to finish my sentence. Yes, Europe has been working on this much earlier. And I've met with, spoken to European counterparts, and there's no question that they were at it earlier. I think whether it's earlier or because it's earlier, that they can be instructive to us. But we are the United States of America, we can help to shape our own destiny, I believe, on artificial intelligence. And I think that legislation that's being offered, the leadership of the administration, the understanding on the part of the administration of broadening this out, and that it needs to be spoken to and possessed by all sectors in our country. I think that is it's a reflection of our values and our democracy.
I said I would take some questions from around the world, and to give you a sense of what I was talking about earlier and the mood of some of the questions that are coming in. Liam Roche asks, given the impasse in Congress, should the US not be more supportive of international rules on AI jointly with the EU and China? What do you have to say to that when, clearly there's a growing realization in the United States that Congress often struggles to get things done? How does that change the way it approaches AI? And again, given that, as you yourself admit, I mean, places like Europe have been ahead of the curve or ahead of the United States on AI regulation.
Well, we can distinguish ourselves by taking action, and we should. And
but how?
I think that the way we always do, legislate. It needs to be carefully drawn. It needs to be thoughtful. It needs to speak to the promise, but it also needs to address the perils. And the perils are more than one. It's not just one area. Do I think that we have the capacity to do it? I have a cautious optimism about it because of the bipartisan interest in the issue and the bipartisan co-sponsorship of very important legislation on the promise front and the peril front. And we can learn from other leaders, other countries, the Europeans. I think that they can be highly instructive. But the United States is, we're independent thinkers and doers. And it's shaped with, it should be shaped with and speak to the values of the United States of America as well.
Last question on this. You obviously represent California's 16th district. Many of your constituents are, big tech companies, some of whom are at the cutting edge of developing AI. And I'm curious, in as much as part of our discussion is about private and public sector cooperating, but the private sector also is immensely powerful in this area and needs to be regulated. Sometimes it is even asking for that regulation. Do you see a conflict of interest at all in how this works, how the pressure works from the private sector, and how you're able to negotiate moments where the public and private sector may have different objectives out of AI regulation?
Well, it's a wonderful question and an important one. Let me share with you what my experience has been with, the top leaders that, as you said, are my constituent companies. In meeting with them, I have posed the following question to them: tell me what you would do if you were in my shoes. And they all say the same thing: let me think about it. So I think that the industry, at least in my view, the industry is waiting for Congress to act, and then they will react to that, just as they have to the president's executive order. It really is up to us to shape the legislation, to develop the guardrails that are needed. We need authenticity in this. When you think of the average person in the United States, how are they to know the difference between something that is fake and something that is authentic? So this goes to how people live, what they receive, what they hear, I think that we need to be very practical at the same time. It seems like a very heady subject matter.
But I have to say, when you ask CEOs, what would you do? Isn't the assumption there that you're assuming that they would do the right thing when, as we've known from the last 20 years of tech development, tech CEOs don't always do the right thing?
Well, we've learned that, certainly. But I'm struck by the fact that they don't have a direct answer and say, I would do A, F, and Z. So I think they're waiting for the Congress. And they've been instructive, even though they accepted several policy issues on a voluntary basis. That was a beginning. It's a good start. We have to partner. We have to partner in this. They know and have called for guardrails, and it's up to us to not only define them, but to codify them.
Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, you are a member of Congress from California's 16th District. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, up next, we have two terrific guests to take us through the rest of this hour. David Lin is a Senior Director of Platforms at the Special Competitive Studies Project, our partner in this event and the next few ones to come in this collaboration. He brings a wealth of experience from over a decade in the government, U.S. government, including his role as an economic foreign service officer at the Department of State with a focus on China and technology policy. And Paul Share, he's an Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security, renowned thought leader in AI, also recognized as one of the 100 most influential people in AI by Time Magazine in 2023. Welcome you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So, David, I thought I'd begin with you. Listening to the conversation that just preceded us with the Congresswoman, what is your sense of how equipped our leaders are to legislate, to try and safeguard people and companies from AI, from the worst of AI? And how do you compare all of that to regulation that you see emerging from Europe or from China?
Thanks for having me. First, just thank you for helping organize this series. We're excited to help you launch this program and looking forward to the conversation we're having today. That's a great question. And I think, like the Congresswoman had noted, the Biden administration's AI executive order really sets a great policy demand signal for how generative AI should be leveraged by all departments and agencies across the government for competitive advantage for national applications. I know a lot of the discourse is focused on how DoD should use it and how the national security apparatus needs to harness these Gen AI applications, which is absolutely true. But one thing that I think the executive order and our own generative AI report highlight is that this is a whole of government issue, a whole of government challenge, and ranging from not only DoD and the IC, but also to government departments like the IRS, to Department of Commerce. All of these departments and agencies can find great utility in the prospects and promise of generative AI. China, as you might know, has been working on regulating AI, has been releasing a flurry of AI regulations over the past few months. One of the stories I love to tell on China's approach to governing and regulating technology dates back to 2010, really. This relatively obscure white paper that they published called the White Paper on the Internet. And in that white paper policy document, they outlined this concept of cyber sovereignty. And in it, it made vague outline references to this idea how China or Beijing wants to control every piece of data that enters its borders, traverses its networks. And at the time, remember, this is 2010, right? So social media platforms coming out of China weren't really a thing. Huawei smartphones were almost a laughable technology at the time. And at the time, I remember a lot of China watchers were scratching their heads as to wonder how this concept of cyber sovereignty even works. Now, fast forward to 2023. China has one of the world's strictest comprehensive AI governance, data governance regimes in the world. And they're parsing this out line by line, bit by bit. And it really demonstrates the policy continuity and attention that organizationally China is able to approach these important tech topics spanning decades. They planted the seeds for these very high-level concepts over a decade ago, and now we're seeing them regulating down to a very technical level. And so all to say, to try to answer your question a bit more directly, China definitely has a more government centric and top-down heavy-handed approach toward these things. I think from the US side, we can take this as a cautionary tale and how we should always try to balance regulation with innovation policy. But I think there's some things that we can learn from what China is doing in this space.
Paul, let me bring you in on this. So China can be heavy-handed in its AI regulation, which has trade-offs that it entails. What is your sense of how the US currently compares to, say, Europe when it comes to being able and equipped to regulate AI in the best way possible?
Thank you, Ravi. Well, one of the things that we're seeing is Europe has taken a regulation-first approach to digital technologies more broadly, and they're doing the same to AI. We saw that really clearly with European regulations on data privacy, for example, the GDPR. And that has a really powerful impact globally on setting what often become the de facto global standards for new technologies, whether that's data privacy in the case of GDPR, or now AI, as the European Union is leaning in with their EU AI Act. Sometimes it's called the Brussels effect. And the US has taken, until recently, a pretty laissez-faire approach to regulating technology. If you look at social media companies, for example, really the federal government's taken a back seat in terms of regulation. Now, I think what's striking in terms of the energy that we're seeing on Capitol Hill, that Representative Issue talked about, or the new Biden administration executive order, is that this US model might be changing, and that we might be seeing not really the European model, but maybe a more balanced approach out of the US government, which is going to leave space for innovation, but also have the government stepping in to regulate in some really key areas, both addressing some of these risks that we've talked about, but also the government coming in ways that can accelerate innovation in terms of things like leveling the playing field for academics and startups to make sure that it's making it easier for them to compete in AI.
Paul, address one thing for me that I asked the Congresswoman, which is, a decade ago, we were talking about China and Huawei, but America a decade ago wasn't able to rein big tech in as much as it should have. And of course, now we see some more sort of reining in with antitrust legislation and the like. How do you see the trade-off between, the government obviously wanting to not stifle innovation, but at the same time, being able to curb any potential excesses of the private sector?
Well, I would hope, and it's easy to be cynical in Washington, and certainly when you look at the history of tech regulation, it's been a lot of shortfalls. That's the reality. But I would hope that Washington has learned some of these lessons from social media and other digital technologies, and that's why we're seeing more proactive regulation on AI. certainly the executive order addresses a whole wide range of concerns about AI in housing and justice and applications in the criminal justice system, putting to guidance for the National Institute of Standards and Technology to set technology standards. That's incredibly valuable. One of the things that government can do to address this concern about the concentration of power among leading tech companies is funding the National AI Research Resource. The executive order puts together a pilot program for this, but really this is going to require congressional authorization and funding to make this real. And that gets at really the heart of what I think you're raising, Ravi, which is how do we level the playing field, make it easier for startups and academics to have access to the data, the computing power that they need to be competitive with AI. And that's going to be helpful in ensuring that we have a more vibrant innovation ecosystem.
David, I'll come back to you. What are the strategic implications of Gen AI for, warfare and defense postures? How are you thinking about changes in the defense space?
Well, maybe I'll just pick up on one thing that Paul said, which was how we need to really boost and take advantage of this generative AI era to support our R&D community here in the States. I think generative AI is one of those technologies where the innovations that you make in generative AI really beget new and exciting forms of innovation. It creates, as we've highlighted in our generative AI report, this flywheel of innovation that should push governments and nations to start to reassess how they prioritize, rack and stack their technology priorities, their technology strategies. And so I think R&D using generative AI to boost R&D is a really important component of this. And this applies both in military and non-military contexts. And then we're seeing exciting applications for this across the tech stack, across the tech sector. Semiconductor design firms can use generative AI to really streamline, optimize their manufacturing and design processes. We're seeing exciting things happening in the convergence of generative AI and industrial sectors when it comes to biotechnology. AlphaFold, for example, is one example of how generative AI is being leveraged to create new innovations in the realm of protein folding. And so all of these have broad competitive implications in addition to defense and military applications. But I think overall, it can bring really accelerated and exponential advantages to the way we approach innovation for both military and non-military applications.
Mm. And I urge everyone watching this discussion to also read the report put out by SCSP. It's really smart, and there are links to it on our website. David, just staying with you, since you've worked so much on economic policy, what are the econ policy implications of Gen AI that you think require more attention to ensure fair and ethical use?
Yes, this is, again, thanks, Ravi, for the plug. One thing we examined closely in our economy report in the generative AI series that SCSP has put out. And in the report, we identify how there's three real core components to the generative economy: compute, talent, and data. And I think these three components bring with them broad economic implications. Generative AI has profound implications for ways to increase worker productivity. We're already seeing this in things like ChatGPT, in the ways that on the white collar side, at least, it can boost worker productivity in terms of just augmenting the way we write and think through some of these problems. On the industrial side, like we've talked about already, it has high potential of reshaping the way we not only manufacture, but the way we optimize and, again, feed in the inputs, the critical inputs to the things that keep our economy running. So it has broad implications for our economy. It also has implications of spawning brand new economies, digital economies from it also. So,
Paul, let me bring you back in. And we have questions from our viewers around the world. I want to put one of those to you. And this is from Callum Madden, who is at Barclays Bank in the UK. And his question is, what happens if some countries don't abide by the regulations that we've been discussing this hour? And what if by not abiding, they win the race to have the most sophisticated AI? How can the US and its allies keep up with that? How do they prevent people from breaking rules and taking advantage of that?
Well, I think it's a great concern, and it's not a hypothetical one. We've seen examples of this already with more mature AI technologies like facial recognition. China has roughly half of the world's 1 billion surveillance cameras, and they're increasingly using facial recognition to track and monitor their citizens in ways that are violating human rights, that are repressing Chinese citizens, and then China is exporting that model globally. So how do we deal with that? Getting China to sign a piece of paper saying they're not going to do it is just not, it's not going to work. I think there's a couple things that democracies can do. One is being a leader in the technology and being a leader in the norms and laws and standards that undergird that technology. So the kinds of efforts that we're seeing in Washington, in the UK, and the EU, even where there might be differences between those approaches, they're relatively minor compared to just the stark differences in the ways that we see the Chinese Communist Party using AI for repression. And then having democracies work to export a model that is privacy preserving, that preserves human rights for using AI abroad, is going to be really essential to ensure that the global adoption of these technologies is in a way that's consistent with human rights and with the important values of freedom and privacy.
Paul, and I meant to sort of also ask you about some of the stuff that's been in the news, so the Bletchley Park Declaration. Just give us a sense of how much of an advance that represents in regulating AI.
Well, I think, a valuable declaration. I think it's really exciting that the UK brought a whole series of countries together, and it's meaningful that China was a part of this declaration, along with a whole host of other countries, talking about the risks of some of the more capable AI systems today, which are largely unknown. There's concern about some of their risks to help people enable biological weapons or malware, offensive cyber weapons, but there's a lot of, I think, uncertainty around that space. China participated in this conversation, agreed to this statement, the Bletchley Declaration, talking about AI risk and need to regulate AI. But we often see in documents coming out of China a big disconnect between what they're saying on paper, which often looks great, and then what they're doing in practice inside China, which sometimes can really look truly horrific in terms of the way that they're using AI for repression. So the Bletchley Declaration is a great first start. It doesn't have a lot of teeth at the moment. I think you got to start somewhere, but I think it remains to be seen whether we're able to get then to a place where there is meaningful regulation and global standards about testing some of the most capable AI systems to minimize some of these risks.
David, let me put another question to you from one of our viewers tuning in. This is Carl Bushman, who's writing to us from Chicago. And he refers to something that came up earlier in this discussion. He says, regarding supply chains and trade policy, what rules and guidelines should be put in place when it comes to public-private partnerships? Your thoughts?
No, absolutely. Public-private partnerships is one of the only ways we can really demonstrate as a country an alternative to the AI governance model that China is putting forth. So an incredibly important part of capturing the way AI fits into this broader technology competition. Again, in our report, we highlight a number of models that we could point to as potential ways the government can work better with industry to not only push for new policy and governance and governing AI, but also putting forth and pushing forward new ways of innovation. So all to say, For example, our national laboratory system has a lot of latent potential, latent compute capacity, for example, that we could use through better public-private partnerships to really push innovation forward and give compute access to academia and researchers that can really help push innovation forward. Government funding for new R&D initiatives, for example, is another area where we're already seeing big movements in the realm of chips and science and IRA, and applying these sources of R&D funding to AI is just as important, and can help build national competitiveness. We posit a couple ideas on how the government can better posture itself to support the R&D community through these funding mechanisms, because that's really what the R&D ecosystem needs, is not only government support, but predictability in terms of sources of funding going into the future. And so all of this can be done through stronger public-private partnerships, and that's something we're very clear on, and we try to push for in multiple ways.
Mm-hmm. Paul, when we were discussing the Bletchley Declaration, you said it's useful, significant that China signed on, but that the declaration doesn't yet have teeth to it. I want to use that same framework to look at Biden's AI executive order from a couple of weeks ago. Do you get the sense that that's similar and that it doesn't quite have teeth to it?
I think there are some provisions that are more meaningful there within the executive order, but there is more that needs to be done. So the executive order is very wide-ranging in terms of scope. It covers just a huge swath of potential concerns about AI, and I think the administration deserves an enormous amount of credit there. Now, a lot of the tasking they're doing to government agencies is go study this and come back to us with a report. That's not necessarily the answer you want to get to in the long run, but that's a good first start to task these agencies to go study a problem about how AI is going to affect their particular sector that they're addressing. There are some areas where the administration has gone a little bit further. One of the more novel provisions is the executive order puts in place a reporting threshold for the largest AI models, these very large foundation models that are very general purpose, things like GPT-4, the new engine behind ChatGPT, and a few other companies have similar, very large, very capable models. And what the executive order does is puts in place this threshold of if there's a certain amount of computing power that's used to train these models, then these companies have to report to the government on their safety standards, the procedures that they're doing to test these models, to red team them to make sure that they're safe beforehand. And then the government tasked the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to come up with its own standards framework. But all of this is just notification. So this is great to get the government more visibility, so the government can get smart on what's going on, so the government can try to catch up with industry to better understand what's happening right at the frontier of AI. But it doesn't actually address at all what happens if the government says that industry's safety standards are not good enough. Now, that's very different than other industries, like in commercial airliners or the FDA's regulation for food or for drugs, where the government actually does have regulatory authority to say, no, that's not safe enough. And so that's probably a place where legislation, like Representative Escher talks about, is going to be needed to put in place that regulatory framework going forward.
Mm-hmm. David, I'll come back to you with another question from one of our viewers around the world. This one is from Anirudh Suri in New Delhi at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If memory serves me right, Anirudh is also the author of a great book, The Great Tech Game, about India's tech development. But the question is, how should the US and India cooperate both on the AI global governance aspect as well as the global competitive aspects of AI? David, any thoughts on that?
No, that's a great question, and I think one of the international frameworks or regional allied and partner blocks that we can really leverage to bring India into the fold. One of the largest democracies in the world, right? And there's a
It
lot of
is
potential.
the largest democracy.
The
in the world.
largest democracy in the world, right?
Yeah.
And we should really leverage that partnership. And I think the Quad is a great, the Quad, Australia, Japan, US, and India is a great regional block by which we can work better with India and bring in other Asia Pacific partners into the fold to work on these shared technology challenges. Again, I think India, through its sheer size, offers a lot of opportunities to work economically together with the US. And again, I think the elephant in the room here is also China. And there's a lot of partnerships that we could build to better flesh out the Quad and push it in a technology direction.
David, same with you. I want to talk a little bit about future proofing because all of this that we're discussing is moving so quickly. We keep using the word exponential when we talk about the growth in Gen AI and AI more broadly. So how can regulatory frameworks be designed to be adaptive and resilient over time?
Yes, and this is something that both regulators, government, and all the stakeholders in this ecosystem have to struggle with, is how to find that right balance between regulation and innovation. Just yesterday, SCSP published a report on high consequential uses of AI, a framework in which we analyze how to assess the highly consequential use cases of AI. And this puts forward, again, a framework by which we're hoping regulators can look at to assess what are the maximum benefits that we hope to obtain from AI use cases, and also at the same time identify the maximum perils. To stay with the theme of the event, the promises and the perils of Gen AI use cases, and we put forward this framework, which identifies 10 categories by which we're hoping regulators can look through and think through, help the regulators think through all the different scenarios by which AI can be used both for a force of good and bad. And again, the trick is, yes, this is a living document. It has to be dynamic. And as we know, this is not an area that government is necessarily excels at. But I think the demand of the time that we're in, the technology era that we're in right now, requires that be it regulation or legislation be agile and evolve over time.
Paul, we've mentioned arms races a little bit today, but not in great detail. And I'm curious how you think about what kinds of policy frameworks are needed to prevent an AI arms race, which, could be immensely destabilizing to the world. When you think about the Promise Peril framework, and when you think about regulation, competition is a big part of this. And if, one country decides to go much further ahead, then that kind of upends the balance of, how to regulate when competition becomes an overriding concern. Especially, I think, for all of this, if you think about autonomous weapon systems. So how are you thinking about that these days? And how does policy and regulation keep pace in that sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. The desire for competition, for seeing China, the United States, the EU, other countries move forward with AI, adopt it in their societies, is a good thing. I think that's to be welcomed, and we can all push each other in ways that might be healthy to innovate faster. One of the big concerns is that in doing so, and trying to move quickly, we see companies and countries taking shortcuts on safety or on the ethical use of these technologies, and saying, well, we just need to get it out there. We can't worry about that. That's where steps like the Bletchley Declaration could be an important step towards global standards for safety for AI that could address some of these concerns, to say, look, yeah, we all want to move forward. We all want to use AI to benefit our societies, to improve social welfare, health outcomes, increase scientific discovery, but we need to be thoughtful. We need to be mindful of some of these risks. of AI. We don't want to put AI models out on the internet that could accelerate the ability for terrorists to do bad things, to generate biological weapons or to create offensive cyber weapons. And so having some standards globally for AI safety, I think, going to be really important. We're at early days of understanding what that is, but that's one place where we want countries to start coming together to understand that. And there have been some nascent conversations on the military space too. There was recently, kind of overshadowed all the other things, two big developments last week, along with the UK summit, the White House executive order. The US and 30 nations released a political declaration outlining some broad principles on military AI. That's a pretty meaningful step forward. And there was a vote at the United Nations for the Secretary General to undertake a study on autonomous weapons. So both of those are not, really like the final sort of solution to addressing concerns about military AI, but an important step in the right direction.
An important step, as is this discussion. Paul Share and David Lin, I thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi.
As I said, this is the first in a 6-part series exploring the future of generative AI. And if you want to stay abreast of the next 5 discussions, you can do that on our website, foreignpolicy.com/events. The discussions today, I think, have really underscored the urgency and importance of our task. These developments not only highlight the rapid advancement of AI technology, but also the critical need for responsible governance and ethical oversight. I said this earlier, but I highly recommend reading SCSP's comprehensive report on this topic. It's a resource that provides greater context and understanding of the issues at hand. The next event in this series will take place on Wednesday, November 29, and it will specifically cover the topic of Gen AI as it relates to governance. Future episodes will address the economy, diplomacy, defense, and intelligence, and I hope you will join us. In closing, I want to thank our speakers today and all of you from around the world for joining in with very intelligent questions and for participating, watching, and learning. This is such a new and fast-moving topic that all of us are learning as we are trying to make a difference in terms of policy and discussions in this space. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy. Take care. We'll see you soon.